Good evening, weary traveller of the glowing rectangle. Draw your blanket a little higher, tuck your cold feet somewhere warm, and imagine, just for tonight, that instead of lying in your bed you are lowering yourself carefully onto a creaking plank of oak on a Viking longship, somewhere out on the grey back of the North Sea, while 64 other snoring, sweating, burping warriors are already sprawled shoulder to shoulder around you, and that I, your humble chronicler, have been appointed by the village council of insomnia to explain how on earth these people did not all simply die of the smell. Because that is really where our story begins, not with heroic charges on a beach or glorious sagas sung in longhouses, but with a far less glamorous question that every modern listener, and probably every medieval nose, eventually had to ask when you put 65 human beings on a narrow wooden boat, give them dried fish, sour milk, weak beer, and no toilets at all, and then push them out into cold open water for weeks at a time. Why did that ship not turn into a floating plague? So let's settle in together and picture it carefully, slowly, in a way that lets your mind wander like a low tide along a rocky coast. You are sitting on the low, open deck of a longship, perhaps the famous kind that once cut across the North Sea toward England or Iceland, and the boards under you are damp with a permanent mix of salt spray and the ghost of spilled beer. Your wool cloak is heavy on your shoulders, stiff at the edges with old dried brine, and when you breathe in, the air that fills your chest is a thick, layered thing made of sea salt and wood tar and smoke from the last shore fire that still clings to the men's hair and beards, and of course the warm, unmistakable scent of 65 human bodies that have been working, rowing, shouting, sleeping and eating in the same 10 or 15 meters of space for days. It is not a cruise ship. There are no cabins to retreat to, no private corners with scented soap, no tidy little metal toilets bolted to white walls. There is only this low open deck, no hold below, the sides of the ship rising only half a meter or so above the waterline, oars protruding like insect legs, shields hanging along the gunwales like a row of round, painted teeth, and under your bare feet the vessel flexes just slightly with each wave, reminding you that everything here is temporary, from the creaking timber to the men themselves. You might expect, if you came from a later century, that such a ship would be a perfect trap for disease, and you would not be alone, because crowded decks did in fact become deadly many times in history, on later naval vessels with neatly built latrines and proper sleeping arrangements, where hammocks swung in rows and water barrels sat tidily lashed in place. Sickness still moved like a shadow along the beams, slipping from hand to hand, from cup to cup, from one unwashed piece of wood to the next, so that cholera or dysentery or typhoid could spread through a crew faster than any enemy cannonball, sending men to their bunks with fever and taking them to the sea in sewn-up canvas. And yet, the Vikings, with no toilets at all, no enclosed infirmary, no surgeon with instruments laid out in a chest, managed to sail incredible distances without turning every voyage into a disaster. They rode from the fjords of Norway to the flat coasts of England. They leapt from their ships into the cold rivers of Eastern Europe. They pushed along the storm-ridden routes toward Iceland and Greenland. And after all of that, we still find their settlements, their descendants, their sagas, instead of empty harbours and mass graves of crews that simply rotted away at sea. The puzzle becomes more curious the longer you think about it, and perhaps as you lie there with your eyes half closed, you can hear the faint creak of leather belts and the scratch of wool on wood, and imagine that you are sharing this deck with men who, according to irritated English chroniclers, actually bathed more often than their neighbours, who combed their hair daily and changed their clothing as regularly as they could, who considered Saturday a kind of official washing day, laugh-a-day, the day of the bath, even when firewood was precious and fresh water had to be hauled and heated. These were not people indifferent to dirt. They were, by the standards of early medieval Europe, almost obsessively tidy, and that makes the sight of an entirely toiletless ship even stranger. Archaeologists, digging patiently in the cool earth of Norway and Denmark centuries later, found this out the hard way. When they uncovered the Oseberg ship in its blue clay grave in 1904 and traced each rib and plank, when they lifted out carved posts shaped like snarling beasts, fragments of fine textile, kitchen vessels, even a wooden bucket bound with iron, they looked for some sign of where 30-odd people had done what 30-odd people must inevitably do over the course of a voyage, and they found nothing. No little enclosed corner that might have served as a latrine, no fixed hearth with a flue for smoke that might hint at some covered area, no permanent built-in solution for waste at all. Perhaps some thought that ship was special, ceremonial, more tomb than transport, designed to carry two high-status women into the afterlife, rather than provide a realistic model of a working crew. But then came other finds, like the Gokstad ship, clearly a practical warship, its timbers worn in places by repeated use, its gear plainly intended for hard travel, and again the same deliberate silence in the design, an almost stubborn refusal to make room for anything like a toilet. Later, with the help of ground-penetrating radar on sites like the so-called Yellowstone ship, we traced every hidden void and timber before a single spade went into the soil, and still, no secret wooden cubicle emerges, no carved seat over a cleverly disguised chute, nothing of the sort that later sailors would take for granted. So your mind, like mine, may be tempted to imagine some awful improvisation, some corner of the deck where filth slowly built up, and men simply endured it. But if you let the picture grow a little wider and smoother, if you look not just at the ship, but at the way it sat in the water, and the way it moved along coasts and rivers, a different, quieter pattern begins to show through. And that pattern is what we are really here for tonight. Because it turns out that the Viking answer to the question, "Where is the bathroom?" was not a piece of furniture at all, but a way of thinking about the ship and the sea. To understand it, you have to stand up, just for a moment in your imagination, swaying a little with the motion of the waves, and walk or shuffle, because there isn't much room, toward the side of the longship. There is no high rail, no tall bulwark to protect you from the wind, just that low edge of planking, half a meter or so above the waterline, close enough that when a wave comes, cold spray can leap up and slap your cloak, and when the weather is calm you can lean out and trail your fingers in the sea, feeling the pull of the wake rushing past. This is not an accident, and while it makes the ship feel exposed and risky, it also means that the boundary between on board and overboard is thin, almost casual. You do not need ropes and ladders and complicated arrangements to dispose of anything you do not want to keep. You simply step to the side, hold on with one hand to a sturdy post or rope, and let the ocean take what you give it. Whether that is a handful of fish guts, a broken bit of wooden cup, or when you are sure of your balance and no wave is about to knock you over, the contents of your own body. So the first and perhaps most important piece of the Viking system was not a latrine but a habit. Human waste went straight over the side into the moving salt water, as quickly and directly as possible, without being collected in some corner, without sitting for hours in a bucket in the heat, without the chance to ferment into the kinds of lethal stews that later built-in toilets and enclosed holds could accidentally create. In calm seas, this would have been as simple and as undignified as we are already imagining, while in rough weather it probably involved ordinary wooden buckets, the same sort you would use at home, pressed into temporary service and then emptied overboard at the first safe moment, never stored, never allowed to linger. It is not glamorous, it is certainly not private, and it relies very heavily on the crew's balance and nerve, but in a strange way it is elegant. Because by refusing to build a permanent place for waste, Viking shipwrights also refused to build a permanent problem. The deck remained a place where things moved, air, water, people, and yes, waste and nothing static. Warm and dark was allowed to develop, in which germs could multiply quietly over days. If you think of the sea itself as a kind of endless, cold, restless cleaning system, constantly diluting and carrying away whatever falls into it, then the longship, with its leaky hull and low sides, becomes less like a sealed container and more like a wooden platform hovering just above that flowing cleanser. And the more closely it stays open to that water, the less chance any one patch of filth has to take root. This does not mean the ship smelled pleasant, nor that everyone remained perfectly healthy, but it does mean that the worst sort of concentrated contamination, the sort that seeded catastrophic outbreaks on larger, more enclosed vessels centuries later, never had the same opportunity to form here. And as you let that image settle, the low side of the ship, the quick, embarrassed trip to the rail, the splash into dark water, and the way the wake folds over and erases the evidence, you can already feel how this simple habit, repeated hundreds of times on every voyage, would have quietly shaped the rhythm of life on board, turning the deck into a space that was always being washed by wind, spray, and the occasional staggered human, instead of a place where hidden corners slowly turned poisonous. It is only the first layer of their strategy, of course, and the sea cannot solve everything, but it is a good place for us to pause, right here at the edge of the ship, hands on the cold, tar-smelling timber, listening to the water rush by in the dark, before we follow these sailors ashore to see how often they escaped this cramped world altogether. And when you finally climb back from the ship's edge and settle once more among the bundles of cloaks and coils of rope, the Longship continues its slow rhythm beneath you, rocking not like a cradle but like some patient old animal that knows every breath of the sea. And you start to notice something else, something that makes the Viking method even more effective than it first appears. This floating wooden beast was never meant to stay far from land for long, because while later sailing ships depended on deep harbours, calm anchorages, and a complicated ballet of ropes and sails to approach a coast, a Viking longship was built with one of the sneakiest advantages in maritime history, an advantage that has everything to do with avoiding sickness, even though no saga ever bothers to mention it. The hull, so shallow that the vessel draws barely a meter of water, allows it to glide toward almost any shoreline, from wide sandy bays to narrow river mouths, from gravelly beaches to muddy flats that would trap a heavier ship. Imagine, in the fading afternoon light, the steersman calling a few words into the wind. The rowers shift, the oars dip, and the whole vessel lifts its head like a hound catching a familiar scent. The bow rises gently on a wave, and then, with a long scraping sigh, it kisses the sand. No dock, no pier, no ceremony. 30 seconds later, those 65 men simply hop over the side and wade through water up to their ankles, pulling the ship a few steps higher so the tide will not drag it back. And just like that, the Longship becomes something completely different. Not a prison of wood and rope, but a temporary home beside a real camp, on real earth, where the wind blows differently, where fires can be lit and food cooked, where clothes can be hung to dry, and where, most importantly for our quiet question tonight, every man can walk a little distance inland and take care of the most basic human needs without fouling the deck or the sea around them. It is here, on these countless makeshift beaches that stretched from Norway to the British Isles, from the Baltic down the Russian rivers, all the way west to Iceland and Greenland, that the Viking sanitation system reveals its second, slower rhythm, one not tied to oars or waves, but to geography itself. For every day or two spent at sea, there came a pause, a landing, a moment when the crew could disperse like birds across the shoreline, leaving behind whatever burden the ship had accumulated. Picture it. A cold morning on the coast of Scotland, mist low over the heather. The Longship sits half on the sand, shields already hung out to dry. A few men kneel at a stream, scrubbing their arms with handfuls of coarse sand. Others haul driftwood to start a cook fire. Someone is mending a torn cloak. 2 more are repairing a cracked oar, and scattered farther out among the dunes, here and there, small figures slip behind bushes or over ridges, taking with them whatever discomfort the ship had forced them to hold. No need for storage of waste, no festering corners aboard. Every voyage contains natural reset points, fresh air, soil that absorbs and neutralizes bacteria, clean water for washing, time for the body to heal from the cramped atmosphere of the deck. It is a slow rhythm, ancient and practical, and it stands in contrast to the rigid structure of later navies, which often had no choice but to confine their crews for weeks without touching land. But when the longships came, not just to a quiet beach but to one of the bigger landfalls, the harbour sites archaeologists have found scattered like fingerprints across northern Europe, the scale of this reset becomes astonishing. Think of Torksey, in England, where what looked like a simple river landing turned out to be a sprawling seasonal base the size of a medieval town. Dozens of temporary huts once stood there. Hearths glowed, workshops clattered. Evidence shows families wintered over in such places, children and all. These were not random stops. They were part of an invisible infrastructure, a network of safe grounds where sanitation was as natural as breathing. And this constant stepping on and off the land explains why Viking ships never needed built-in toilets, or sealed waste pits, or elaborate systems like those that later navies invented in desperation. The sea handled immediate dispersal. The land handled everything else. The ship was a corridor, not a container, a bridge between two solid places, never meant to keep humans boxed inside it for long stretches. Still, land and sea together can only do so much, and the Vikings, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps because of some old inherited instinct, added another layer to this strange accidental public health system. A layer not of wood or rope, but of habit, culture, expectation. A quiet kind of discipline that every man in the crew felt, whether he wanted to or not. And that, dear listener, curled under blankets, is where our drifting story now leads to the combs, the baths, the rituals of cleaning that made these sailors, ironically, impossibly, some of the most hygiene-conscious people in medieval Europe. If you listen closely now, past the groan of timbers and the sigh of waves, you can almost hear another sound woven into the fabric of Viking life, a softer rhythm beneath the clatter of oars and the hiss of the wind. It is the click-click of bone combs, the splash of water in shared bowls, the scrape of sand used as a rough soap, the small domestic noises of men who refuse to let filth claim them, even in the harshest conditions the North Atlantic can conjure. Because to truly understand how Vikings avoided the plagues that later devoured crews on far more advanced ships, you must picture not only the longship itself, but the men aboard it, specifically the way they chose to present themselves to each other, day after day without fail. Imagine a crewman now, sitting cross-legged near the mast as the first light breaks over a grey sea. His hair is braided back, but the braids are already fraying after a hard night of rowing. From a leather pouch at his belt he draws a comb carved from bone, its teeth worn smooth from years of use, and he begins to work it carefully through his hair. Not a luxury, not vanity, a ritual, a duty. Another man joins him, then another, and soon a small cluster of warriors are grooming themselves with the solemn focus of monks copying a manuscript. This scene is not poetic fancy. Archaeologists have found dozens of combs in Viking graves, often buried with their owners as if they were as essential as a sword or shield. Some were decorated with animal motifs. Others were plain and sturdy. All were worn in exactly the sort of way that suggests daily use, not occasional grooming, not rare festival preparation, but a habit as regular as eating. The English chronicler John of Wallingford, who was decidedly not a fan of Vikings, complained bitterly that these invaders were too clean, that they washed every Saturday, combed their hair daily, and even changed their clothing more often than the English did. An outrage in his opinion, because it made Viking men irresistible to the local women. He meant it as an insult. It accidentally revealed one of the most effective disease prevention systems in medieval Europe. Daily combing doesn't just tidy hair, it removes lice. Weekly bathing doesn't just refresh tired muscles, it disrupts the reproductive cycle of parasites. Changing clothes doesn't just improve appearance, it reduces bacterial buildup. And on a long ship, crowded, cold, damp, overflowing with opportunities for transmission, every one of these habits acted like a shield. Now imagine, as the ship rocks gently beneath you, the social pressure built into this simple routine. A man who showed up uncombed, unwashed, smelling foul or crawling with lice would draw looks, laughter, maybe even disgust. Shame, soft, invisible, powerful, kept everyone in line far more effectively than any written rule or stern officer ever could. These were not soldiers under strict Navy command. There were no sanitation officers, no health inspections, no punishment lists. There was simply culture, expectations, and the knowledge that the man beside you might be the one rowing in your place during a storm, or standing shoulder to shoulder with you during a landing raid. And yet, for all the combing and bathing and cold water scrubbing, something still lurked aboard these ships, something invisible, far more dangerous than lice or sweat, something stored not in men but in barrels. Fresh water, or rather the way freshwater spoils. Picture, just for a moment, a wooden barrel sloshing under a crossbeam bound with iron bands. The water inside came from a stream back home, collected before the voyage. It tasted fine then, clean, but wooden staves are porous. Bacteria cling to the grain. In the darkness and stillness of that barrel, microbes multiply quietly, turning fresh water into something foul, sometimes deadly. Later navies learned this lesson in agony. Men grew sick from their own water supply, but Vikings, without knowing the science, avoided this trap almost entirely. They didn't set to carry much plain water. They carried weak beer and sour milk. Weak beer requires boiling during brewing, an accidental yet perfect form of pasteurization. Sour milk ferments, dropping its pH to levels most bacteria simply cannot survive. To the Vikings, these drinks were chosen because they lasted longer and tasted better than stagnant water. To modernize, they functioned as built-in safety systems. No contaminated water, equal sign no cholera. No stagnant barrels, no bacterial bloom. No untreated bilge pools, equal sign no filth left to rot. And speaking of bilges, those clinker-built hulls of overlapping planks, kept together with tar and animal hair, were never fully watertight. Seawater seeped in, constantly. Crews spent part of every day bailing it out with wooden scoops. In later ships, tall, deep-sealed vessels, bilges became festering pits where scraps of food, drops of blood, spilled stew, vomit, and unmentionable waste collected into horrifying soups that incubated disease. In Viking ships, everything that fell below deck was immediately diluted with salt water and then bailed out into the sea. No time to rot, no time to ferment, no time to turn into poison. And as you sit here on this imagined deck, listening to the clunk of the bailers and the sigh of waves brushing the planks, you can begin to feel just how many layers of this accidental health system were working together. The open deck, letting wind scatter germs, the low freeboard turning the sea into a toilet, the shallow draft granting constant access to shore, the grooming rituals stopping parasites, the fermented drinks killing bacteria, the leaking hull flushing the ship. A dozen small things, each insufficient alone, but together forming an elegant answer to a problem the Vikings never needed to put into words. But we are not done drifting through this story yet, because even with all of these advantages, something else, something quieter, stranger, almost philosophical, held these crews together and kept them alive through the restless dark of the North Atlantic. And that is where we go next. And so, as the Longship continues to heave gently beneath a sky the color of cold iron, you begin to sense that all these separate habits and accidents, throwing waste straight into the sea, beaching the ship whenever a safe shoreline appeared, combing hair until the teeth of the bone comb grew soft as river stones, drinking weak beer that had once been boiled into safety, bailing seawater from the bilge before it could ever sour, were not isolated tricks, but threads in a single, continuous fabric of survival. A fabric woven not by engineers with blueprints or scholars with theories, but by generations of sailors who learned, slowly and stubbornly, that the best way to stay alive on a wooden ship was to keep everything moving: the air, the water, the people, the routines, the very idea of cleanliness itself, never letting anything waste, dirt, stagnant fear, sit still long enough to become dangerous. It is in this restless motion that you find the last and perhaps most subtle element of Viking health, the understanding, instinctive rather than intellectual, that a ship is not a house, not a fortress, not a sealed world like the galleons of later centuries, but a kind of floating threshold between land and sea, a place to pass through, not to live inside, a platform that remains safe only so long as it never tries to be anything other than temporary, so long as its crew never pretends they can trap comfort or privacy or permanence aboard a vessel whose entire design whispers that everything must be open, leaky, exposed and constantly renewed by wind and water. This philosophy, if we may call it that, reveals itself most clearly on nights when storms gather over the horizon, when dark waves rise like walls around the longship, and the men sit huddled with their cloaks pulled tight, their faces streaked with spray, each of them aware that in such conditions the neat routines of overboard disposal and shoreline breaks might be suspended for hours on end, perhaps even a full day, forcing them to make temporary miserable compromises that rely on buckets and on hope. Yet even then the danger remains limited, because the moment the sea calms even slightly, every man knows exactly what must be done, and the ship resets itself like a living organism, expelled of its toxins, returning to a state of cleanliness that is crude but effective. You can almost see it in your mind's eye. The storm has passed, the horizon glows faintly with early light, and the crew rises, stiff and exhausted, yet moving with a practiced rhythm, emptying buckets over the side, rinsing them with seawater, shaking out damp cloaks, combing hair, checking the bilge, tidying gear, restoring the thousand small habits that keep the deck from turning into the sort of stinking, enclosed trap that doomed so many later mariners who believed that building walls and compartments would tame the sea, when in truth it only isolated the rot. And as you watch these motions play out, slow, deliberate, almost meditative, you realize that this was the quiet genius of Viking sanitation, a system woven entirely into behavior rather than infrastructure, built into the shape of the ship and the expectations of the men, fearless of the cold, ruthless with waste, humble before the ocean, trusting that the best way to keep disease away was to leave nothing on board long enough for disease to take root, turning the very harshness of the environment into a kind of accidental medicine that allowed them to cross oceans in boats that, by all logic, should have been floating sickness factories. Because in the end, the Vikings did not conquer distance by building cleaner ships than anyone else. They conquered it by embracing the reality that their ships could never be clean in any comfortable or familiar sense, and by learning instead to keep them so open, so exposed, so relentlessly flushed by wind, water and habit, that filth never had the chance to become more than a momentary inconvenience, a passing discomfort swept away as quickly as it appeared, leaving the crew, tired, hungry, cold, but still healthy enough to row, to press onward across seas that would have killed less flexible sailors in days. And there, in that understanding, in that long, slow exhale of resignation and practicality, lies the final answer to how Vikings managed waste on their longships without getting sick. They survived not by fighting the environment, but by surrendering to it just enough to let the sea itself become their sanitation system, their cleanser, their endless and merciless tide that carried away everything unwanted, leaving behind nothing but wet wood, cold air, and a crew that was, against all odds, clean enough to live another day. And when you follow this idea to its natural end, letting it stretch into one long, unbroken thought, the way a sail stretches into the wind, you begin to see that Viking survival was not the product of a single clever invention or a secret device hidden beneath the deck, but rather the outcome of an entire world view in which every aspect of life aboard a longship, every gesture, every routine, every choice of material and method, worked together to prevent waste, sickness, and stagnation from ever gaining a foothold, so that the very structure of the voyage became a kind of moving equilibrium, a fragile but remarkably resilient balance between human bodies and the brutal openness of the sea. For the true secret, if there is one, lies in the fact that the Longship was never allowed to become what later ships inevitably became: a closed system, a trapped ecosystem, where air, water, sweat, food scraps, and waste all mixed and transformed into the invisible clouds of contagion that haunted later naval history. Instead, the Vikings treated the boundaries of their vessel as permeable, accepting that the ocean's breath and the ocean's reach would enter the ship whether they wished it or not, and deciding, whether consciously or by inherited wisdom, to lean into that fact rather than fight it, allowing the endless churn of salt water and wind to do for them what walls, pipes, buckets, and barrels could never do. Consider for a moment how this must have felt in the body. Day after day of cold air rushing across your skin, drying sweat before it could sour, scouring clothing that would have rotted in the humidity of an enclosed stinking hold, night after night of sleeping in open air where breath dispersed into the sky, rather than accumulating in a festering cloud under a low, dripping ceiling, and hour upon hour of work that forced you to grip ropes and oars constantly washed by seawater, your hands rinsed by the waves even as you rowed, creating a kind of unintentional but continuous cleansing cycle that broke the chains of transmission long before anyone understood what transmission was. Add to this the fact that the food and drink consumed aboard were themselves resistant to contamination: dried fish that lasted for months, smoked meats that kept well in cool climates, weak beer that had been boiled into safety, sour milk that preserved itself through its own acidity, and you begin to see a portrait of a health system based entirely on necessity, shaped by the environment in which the Vikings lived and travelled, each piece reinforcing the next, until the whole system became stronger than any of its individual parts. And when those parts occasionally failed, when sickness did creep aboard, when a man developed a fever or suffered intestinal trouble, there was no hidden space in the ship for the illness to spread to. The wind carried it away, the next landing diffused it across open ground, the grooming rituals stripped it of its vectors, and the cold, harsh, constantly moving world of the North Atlantic ensured that nothing soft or warm or confined enough to harbour a plague could last for long. In this way, the Longship becomes almost symbolic, a vessel designed around the principle that survival depends not on controlling nature, but on adapting to it more gracefully than your enemies, on keeping everything fluid and temporary, on never letting the rot settle, on never letting the air grow heavy, on never allowing the boundary between clean and unclean to be anything other than a flowing, ever-shifting line that moves with the waves rather than resisting them. And this is why, as you lie there now imagining the creak of timber beneath you and the endless grey horizon around you, you can almost feel the strange comfort that comes from this approach, a comfort not of warmth or softness or privacy, but of knowing that the very conditions that make the voyage miserable also keep you alive, that the cold air that bites your cheeks is the same air that prevents sickness from clinging to you, that the leaky hull you curse as you bail water is the same hull that refuses to let filth accumulate, that the lack of a toilet is not an oversight, but a deliberate absence that turns the whole ocean into your sanitation system. And so the Vikings, without knowing a single thing about microbes or pathogens or epidemiology, solved the problem of waste at sea by refusing to let waste stay anywhere near them, by turning their ship into an extension of the coastline, by transforming inconvenience into health, by embracing the hard truth that on a longship, the only safe waste system is the one that never allows waste to exist for more than a moment before the sea takes it away, an elegant, brutal, and strangely effective solution that kept them alive long enough to carry their stories to Iceland, Greenland, and the edges of North America, where their descendants would marvel that such simple methods had carried entire generations across the most unforgiving waters on Earth. And so we drift toward the final shape of this strange Viking logic, letting it unfold slowly in one continuous breath. Because when you understand how every element of their world, ship design, daily habits, environmental exposure, provisioning choices, and cultural expectations, wove together into a single tapestry of accidental health management, you begin to realize that the Vikings didn't just survive their voyages by luck or toughness alone, but by leaning instinctively into a principle so simple and yet so profoundly effective that modern sanitation engineers still recognize its truth. Nothing dangerous can build up if nothing is allowed to stay still. Picture it clearly now, in one long, unbroken scene, a longship riding low on the swell, its planks dark with spray and tar, its men moving about the deck in a slow, tired procession after a long night at sea, each one performing tasks that look ordinary, but which together form an invisible shield against disease. One man combs his beard with a bone comb whose teeth glint softly in the morning light, shaking loose the miniature world of lice and eggs that never gets the chance to multiply. Another pours out the contents of a temporary storm bucket into the churning grey water, where it vanishes instantly into the cold, massive embrace of the North Sea. Two more haul up a bailer, scooping the bilge clean of brine before it can stagnate, their hands rinsed raw by the salt. Others pass around a skin of weak beer, its taste flat and simple, but its boiled origins safeguarding them from the invisible poisons lurking in untreated fresh water. And still others sit quietly, cleaning their cloaks, adjusting their belts, restoring order to the tiny fraction of the world that the ship represents, knowing that soon, perhaps within hours, the hull will scrape onto a new shoreline where they will scatter across land like birds released from a cage, letting the soil and wind disperse whatever the sea could not. In this single continuous rhythm of motion, waste going overboard the moment it appears, bodies washed in cold seawater whenever land allows, bilge water scooped and thrown back into the waves, lice combed out before they can breed, barrels filled not with treacherous water but with boiled beer and fermented milk, voyages shaped around frequent landfalls rather than long imprisoning stretches at sea. The longship becomes something more like a breathing organism than a vessel, constantly taking in clean air and clean water while expelling everything foul as quickly as it forms, never allowing its narrow wooden frame to become a trap for the very men who depend on it. And even if a sickness does slip aboard, as it inevitably must, when people live so tightly together, it finds little room to take root, because the deck is open to the sky, the air is bitter and clean, the ship touches land before infection can brew into an outbreak, and the cultural habits of grooming, washing, and rotating duties ensure that pathogens find no stable ground, no warm, dark corner in which to multiply, no stagnant puddle in which to bloom, no shared, unwashed vessel in which to concentrate. Instead, they are scattered thinly across water, air and soil diluted by forces far stronger than any Viking could command, but which the Vikings understood well enough to trust with their lives. And this is where the hidden brilliance of their system becomes undeniable. By designing ships that leaked in just the right ways, opened in just the right places, landed at just the right intervals, and demanded from their crews a daily routine of grooming and movement, the Vikings created a sanitation strategy that required no knowledge of germs, no written rules, no specialized equipment, and no conscious planning beyond the simple need to move, to clean, to step ashore, to let the sea wash away whatever the day had brought, and to prepare themselves for the next stretch of cold, salt, and wind. In the end, their survival was not a miracle, but a consequence of a world where nothing stayed still long enough to rot, where filth had no time to become poison, where human waste dissolved into the ocean faster than it could harm anyone, and where the very discomforts of open-deck sailing, the cold, the damp, the exposure, acted like a kind of blunt, natural antibiotic. And it is this constant, almost philosophical acceptance of motion, exposure, and impermanence that allowed Viking crews to cross thousands of kilometers of brutal water, without succumbing to the epidemics that later ravaged much larger and better equipped ships, proving in their quiet, practical way that sometimes the most effective sanitation system is not the one you build, but the one you refuse to build, relying instead on the tireless cleansing forces of the natural world to sweep your problems away before they ever become deadly. And if you let the idea deepen even further, sinking into it the way a keel sinks into water, you begin to understand that the Vikings' greatest safeguard against disease was not any single habit or trick, but the rhythm of their lives, the slow tidal pattern of effort and release, exposure and cleansing, confinement and escape, that kept their bodies and their environment from ever settling into the kind of static, stagnant conditions in which sickness thrives, so that every hour aboard a longship became part of a long continuous cycle of dilution, dispersal, and renewal. Imagine the longship at dawn, sliding across a cold, pewter-coloured sea, the wind sharp against your face, the planks beneath your feet, damp but clean in the way. Only salt and spray can make things clean. The smell of tar rising from the seams where animal hair mixed with resin keeps the water at bay just enough to remain manageable. Oars rise and fall in a rhythm as ancient as muscle itself, and with each pull a thin mist of seawater drifts over the men, rinsing their hands, soaking their sleeves, scouring away whatever might have lingered from the night's discomforts. Nothing warm survives long here, not sweat, not smell, not sickness, because the North Atlantic is always pressing in, always ready to wash and chill and dilute anything that tries to cling to skin or wood. And when the sea becomes too rough for overboard routines, when waves tower and the longship creaks like a living creature in pain, the men endure temporary compromises with buckets and close quarters. Yet even then, the danger remains short-lived because they know that storms pass quickly in these latitudes, that the moment the horizon clears even slightly, they will tilt those buckets, spill their burdens into the sea, rinse everything with cold water and restore the fragile balance of their floating world before the next dawn. The deck, no matter how chaotic the storm, never has time to turn into a true breeding ground for filth. Hours later, perhaps in the late morning, the lookout calls out a patch of shoreline, a simple gravel bank, nothing more, and with practiced motions the crew turns the longship toward it, letting the shallow hull kiss the earth with a sigh. The men step off, spreading out instinctively, some moving to check the bowline, others to gather driftwood, others still to relieve themselves far from the water, knowing from experience that doing so on land resets the entire shipboard environment, wiping away the cumulative pressure of confinement. They do not think of it as sanitation, they think of it as stretching their legs, catching their breath, preparing camp. Yet in this simple act, the biological burden that would have doomed later, enclosed crews dissolves into open soil and wind. Later still, as campfires smoke in the pale afternoon light, the crew washes their cloaks in cold streams, scrubs their arms and faces with sand and seawater, shakes out bedding, and lets the breeze carry away the remnants of sweat and grime. The shoreline becomes an extension of the ship's instinctive hygiene, a vast open place where the elements do the work no man needs to understand. When they launch again, bellies full, gear dry, bodies scrubbed, the ship is reborn, as if the last days of cramped hardship never happened. And all the while, their cultural habits reinforce the cycle. Every man combs his hair, not from vanity, but because a louse found today is a plague prevented tomorrow. Every man takes part in the weekly washing, not because he fears sickness, but because the shame of neglect is heavier than the weight of cold water. Every man drinks the weak beer that has been boiled into safety, not because he suspects contaminated water, but because this is what his people have done for generations. They live within a web of small habitual acts that together form a powerful barrier against disease, even though no one could have explained why. When night falls again, and the ship pushes back into deeper water, the cold wind sweeps across the open deck, polishing away the day's smells and drying the damp wool on their shoulders. The bilge breathes with the waves, taking in water, spitting it out, endlessly preventing the silent, hidden rot that later sailors would come to fear. And the longship glides forward, cleaner than logic suggests it should be, healthier than its cramped geometry predicts, saved by 1,000 tiny motions that never allow filth or sickness to settle. This, finally, is the heart of the Viking system. A life built on movement, exposure, and ritual. A ship that acts not as a sealed refuge, but as an open platform. A crew that lives in harmony with wind and water rather than fighting them. An environment that is harsh enough to be cleansing, cold enough to inhibit disease, open enough to scatter whatever dangers arise, and flexible enough that no single failure, no missed washing, no spilled food, no brief illness can collapse the entire balance. And when you see all of this woven together into one continuous picture, you realize that the question, how did Vikings manage waste on longships without getting sick, is almost misleading, because the truth is that they did not manage waste in the way we imagine. Instead, they managed the conditions in which waste could become dangerous, shaping their entire way of life so that rot, stagnation, and infection never had the time, warmth, or stillness to take hold, leaving them cold, exhausted, soaked to the bone, but astonishingly resilient, ready to press onward toward lands they had never seen before. And as the longship presses deeper into the grey immensity, the horizon stretching like a thin blade between sea and sky, you begin to understand that this entire sanitation system, if we can call something so instinctive a system, was really a continuous negotiation between human frailty and the indifferent power of nature, a long, unbroken conversation in which the Vikings learned, through centuries of trial and error, that survival depended not on building walls around themselves, but on allowing the elements to sweep through their lives, carrying away everything that could become a threat if left to fester. Picture the men now, settling into the middle hours of the day, as the wind steadies and the ship cuts a clean, narrow path through the cold water. The deck is open on all sides, no roof to trap the breath of 65 bodies, no walls to hold in the stale air that would eventually grow heavy with moisture and disease. The very discomfort the Vikings endured, the biting wind, the constant spray, the damp wool that never fully dries, became their greatest ally, because air that never settles never gives germs a chance to linger, and surfaces that are endlessly rinsed by salt water never grow the invisible film of contamination that plagued later ships. Look at the hull beneath your imagined feet. The overlapping planks of oak sealed with tar and animal hair, breathing in seawater with each wave only to spit it back out through the relentless labour of the bailers. In a medieval town, a puddle left in a dark corner might become a silent factory of disease. On a Viking longship, the equivalent puddle never lasted more than a few hours, because the ship itself was too alive, too exposed, too intertwined with the ocean to let water stagnate long enough for danger to form. The bilge water sloshed, mixed, diluted, and was tossed back into the waves before it could sour, turning what might have been a deadly weakness into a continuous cleansing cycle that no medieval engineer could have designed more effectively. Now let your mind wander toward the oarsmen, broad-shouldered, wind-burned, wrapped in layers of wool, who switch positions with a tired grunt, handing the same wooden oars from calloused palm to calloused palm. Each grip might seem like the perfect opportunity for germs to leap from one man to another, and yet those oars are never warm, never dry, never coated in the grime of enclosed quarters. They are washed 100 times a day by spray, they are bleached by sun and wind, and they remain too cold and too wet for most pathogens to survive, turning what looks like a vulnerability into another accidental safeguard. Farther down the deck, the cook reaches for a barrel of weak beer to prepare a midday ration, and in opening it he unknowingly reveals another reason his crew stays healthy. That beer, light and unremarkable though it may be, has been boiled during brewing, its water rendered safe long before anyone knew what boiling accomplished. The sour milk stored beside it carries its own antimicrobial armor in the form of lactic acid. There is no warm, stagnant fresh water to poison the crew from within. No dark barrel quietly turning lethal. Everything they drink has already been pushed through a process that destroys what later sailors would dread. Meanwhile, the men, though rough and hardened, maintain routines that look almost delicate in contrast to their surroundings. One combs his beard again, perhaps absent-mindedly. Another checks his cloak for lice. A third rinses a small wooden bowl in seawater, the brine biting his fingers but leaving the surface of the bowl clean of residue. These gestures are not heroic, not dramatic. They are simply woven into the fabric of Viking life, enforced by custom, reinforced by pride, and made nearly sacred by the knowledge that a man who lets himself fall into filth risks not only shame but the well-being of every soul aboard. By evening, when the ship glides toward another anonymous shoreline, perhaps a rocky inlet in the Faroes, perhaps a quiet bay in the Northern Isles, the men move with weary precision, guiding the prow onto land so smoothly that even the goatskin bags lying near the mast barely shift. They disembark, stretching stiff legs, and once again the cycle of renewal begins. Some head inland to relieve themselves far from the water, others gather wood, others strip off their outer layers to air them out in the fading light. Fires crackle, steam rises, cloaks dry. Whatever waste or strain built up on the ship dissolves into the vastness of open ground and open air, resetting the biological clock of the voyage for another stretch at sea. As night gathers, they launch again, their bodies tired but restored, their ship once more a clean slate, not in the civilized sense of polished decks and scented soaps, but in the deeper, more essential sense of being free from the slow accumulation of danger. And the Longship, this improbable, leaking, wind-lashed, open-decked marvel, carries them onward, propelled not just by muscle and wood, but by a philosophy that turns harshness into health, exposure into protection, and the very absence of comfort into the anchor of their survival. For in the end, the secret of Viking sanitation is a kind of wisdom hidden in plain sight, that a place where nothing can accumulate is a place where nothing can decay, and a place where nothing can decay is a place where sickness struggles to survive. And so the Vikings, without knowing the science, arranged their world so thoroughly around movement, cold, salt, wind, and ritual, that disease never had the stillness it required to grow, leaving their longships crowded, uncomfortable, but astonishingly resilient, as some of the healthiest floating communities in the ancient world. And as the longship carves its way through the thickening dusk, with the sky fading from iron grey to the deep blue of a northern night, the air sharpening around the crew like a blade honed by cold, you begin to see that all these movements, bailing, grooming, rinsing, rowing, landing, washing, emptying, scrubbing, aren't just practical tasks but part of a living rhythm, a pulse that keeps the ship from ever slipping into the deadly quiet of stagnation, because the only true enemy on a vessel like this is not the waves or the wind, or even the long hours of labour, but the stillness that lets filth settle, that lets warmth gather, that lets breath turn stale, and disease take root in spaces where nature cannot reach. For here, on this open deck beneath the drifting stars, nothing is ever truly still. The oars dip in and out of the sea, like the heartbeat of the ship. The wind rushes over the planks, stripping moisture and carrying away the invisible traces of the day. The salt water clings to clothing only long enough to cleanse it, before cold air dries it again, and even the men themselves, tired as they are, shift and shuffle and adjust their cloaks, brushing away whatever might cling to skin or cloth. In this ceaseless motion, the ship becomes an extension of the natural world, too alive, too exposed, too restless to let decay gather strength. Imagine standing at the stern now, hands resting on the smooth, tar-darkened wood, watching the wake stretch behind like a long pale ribbon dissolving into the dark water. Every splash is a small erasure, every wave a swipe of cold purity across the vessel's surface. The sea behind you is already swallowing the traces of the day. Fish scraps thrown overboard, rinse water tossed by hand, waste diluted into infinity, leaving the ship cleaner by absence than any built latrine could ever make it. Nothing remains long enough to become harmful, Everything is carried off by the ocean that both supports and disciplines the crew. Now shift your gaze to the men settling down for the night. One tucks his comb back into its leather pouch. Another checks his boots for dampness. Another shakes out a fleece-lined cloak before wrapping it around his shoulders. These gestures, repeated day after day, are small acts of defiance against the filth that could so easily overwhelm a crew confined in a cramped environment. But they're also acts of connection, each man maintaining himself not because a captain ordered it, but because he understands his place in the delicate ecosystem of the ship, an ecosystem that only survives when everyone participates in the invisible work of staying clean enough, healthy enough, orderly enough. And if you look closely, you'll notice how nature collaborates with them. The cold suppresses bacteria that would multiply wildly on warmer seas. The constant wind dries surfaces too quickly for mold or rot. The leaking planks, tiresome as they are, prevent the lower spaces from ever becoming the stagnant swamps that plagued the galleons and frigates of later centuries. The longship is porous, draughty, relentlessly exposed, and because of that it does not trap danger, does not create pockets of air that spoil, does not gather the silent menace of enclosed humidity. It is a miserable place to sleep, and yet, paradoxically, a much safer place to live. Then comes the moment just before the night fully takes hold, when the ship slows and the steersman murmurs to the rowers, guiding them toward another piece of shoreline barely visible in the last traces of light. The men ready themselves, shoulders rolling, eyes scanning for rocks and shallows. The bow touches land, the hull grinds softly against sand or pebbles, and once again the crew flows off the ship, like water spilling from a tilted bowl, eager for the relief of solid ground, where the forest or hillside or quiet dunes become their temporary refuge. They fan out, each man instinctively choosing a spot far from the rest, each step scattering what little biological burden the day has accumulated, leaving behind a landscape vast enough to swallow it harmlessly. By the time they return, their boots carrying traces of soil, their cloaks dried by firelight, their faces washed in cold stream water, the ship has become a blank slate once more, ready to be carried back into the shifting dark. Nothing of yesterday's waste remains. Nothing of yesterday's discomfort lingers. Nothing of yesterday's filth has the chance to harden into danger. The longship breathes again, open, light, rinsed, reset. And in this continuous cycle, sea to land, land to sea, exposure to cleansing, labor to renewal, the Vikings found their unintentional cure for the sickness that later generations would understand only through science. They kept their world in motion, their bodies in ritual, their ship in constant exchange with the unforgiving elements, and by refusing to let anything accumulate, they denied disease the stillness it needs to spread. This is why their voyages endured. This is why their crews stayed healthy enough to row, raid, trade, explore, and return. They survived not because they outsmarted nature, but because they allowed nature to do what no enclosed sanitation system could have done: sweep everything away before it became a threat, leaving behind nothing but cold air, salt water, and the unbroken determination of the men who trusted the sea to carry both their burdens and their survival. And as the night deepens around the longship, with the constellations steady above and the cold whisper of the wind threading between shields and oarlocks, you begin to recognize that the Vikings' success in avoiding shipborne sickness rested on a principle so simple that it almost disappears when you look at it directly. They never let the ship become a place where anything waste, water, heat, breath, filth, or even routine itself could gather, accumulate, or stagnate long enough to become dangerous. Because in a world of constant movement, nothing harmful has the time or the stillness to grow teeth. Consider the air aboard the longship, always moving, always cut through by wind from the open sea. There is no ceiling to trap warmth and moisture, no walls to collect the sour exhalations of dozens of men, no corners in which the dampness of human life can thicken into rot, and so the breath of each crew member dissolves into the vastness around them, before it can circle back into anyone's lungs. The cold that creeps into their bones is the same cold that keeps pathogens from thriving, the same cold that scours surfaces and slows decay, the same cold that makes the deck uncomfortable but safe. Then there is the water, endlessly present, endlessly in motion. Salt water leaps over the bows, coats clothing, rinses hands, splashes across planks, and seeps through cracks only to be scooped out and thrown back with the same rhythm as breathing. In a closed ship, water becomes a stagnant pool, an unseen enemy. In a Viking ship, water is a visitor, never a resident, always moving through, never staying long enough to become anything other than temporary inconvenience. The bilge cannot rot because it cannot rest. It is always refreshed, always emptied, always new. Even their food plays into this dance of renewal. Dried fish, smoked meats, bread baked to hardness, weak beer boiled into purity, sour milk fermented into self-preservation. Nothing fresh enough to rot quickly, nothing soft enough to breed illness, nothing stored in dark, still barrels long enough to sour into poison. Every mouthful they consume is either inert or protected by fire and fermentation. Each sip another small safeguard against the invisible dangers that later sailors would take for granted. And on top of this, layered like a final sheath of protection, lies the quiet discipline of the crew, the combing of hair, the washing of faces, the shaking out of cloaks, the weekly bathing, the shared expectation that no man should let himself slip into filth when every other man depends on him. This discipline is not polite or delicate. It is as practical as sharpening an axe. A louse removed today prevents a sickness tomorrow. A cloak aired out tonight prevents a rash next week. A shared bowl of water, even if not perfectly sanitary by modern standards, represents a commitment to some form of order, some form of care, some recognition that hygiene is not just personal but communal. Now imagine this entire system unfolding, not over hours but over weeks, as the longship moves from one coastline to the next. The men disembark and scatter across the land to relieve themselves far from camp. They wash their clothes in icy streams. They light fires that dry smoke, cleanse. They sleep on soil and grass rather than on planks that hold yesterday's moisture. Each landing resets the clock. Each departure starts it again. Nothing has time to fester because everything is interrupted. Everything is swept away. Everything dissolves into the world before it becomes a threat. And woven through all of this is a deeper truth, that the longship itself, this sleek, low-slung vessel of tar-stained wood, was deliberately built to avoid becoming a miniature world. It was not a home. It was not a fortress. It was not a place to hide from nature. It was a place that embraced nature, allowed nature inside, relied on nature to do what humans could not, to disperse waste, strip away moisture, cool the air, dilute filth, suppress bacteria, prevent stagnation, and keep the crew healthier than any enclosed vessel of the medieval or early modern world. So when you ask how the Vikings managed waste on their longships without getting sick, the answer stretches far beyond the image of a man leaning over the side or emptying a bucket into the sea. It extends into every corner of their existence aboard the ship, into every habit, every material choice, every cultural expectation, every landing site, every breath of cold wind that scraped across their skin. They survived because nothing in their world was still, not the water, not the air, not the routines, not even the discomforts. Everything moved, and in that movement lay their salvation. A sanitation system not of walls and pipes but of openness and exposure. A health strategy not of medicine but of instinct. A protection not engineered in wood or metal but sewn into the rhythm of daily life. The Vikings lived inside the world, not apart from it. And the world, harsh, frigid, merciless, kept them alive by refusing to let anything linger long enough to kill them. And as the longship drifts deeper into the cold blue silence of the northern sea, with the soft groan of timber rising and falling like the breathing of some vast wooden creature, you begin to realize that this entire Viking approach to waste, This strange mixture of exposure, instinct, ritual, and necessity was not a detail of shipboard life, but the very backbone of their survival, because everything about the Longship, from the way it rode low in the water to the way the crew lived upon it, worked together to make sure nothing harmful ever had the chance to settle, ferment, or transform into the invisible danger that later sailors would fear far more than storms or enemies. If you imagine the ship not as a vessel but as a kind of floating lung, always inhaling the clean brutality of the sea and exhaling its impurities, you can almost see how every action contributes to that rhythm. A man rinses a bowl in seawater and the brine scours it clean before he has even shaken the droplets away. Another leans over the side at dawn, letting the wind whip away the steam from his breath and the cold erase the warmth that sickness loves. Another tips out a bucket from the night, its contents breaking apart instantly in the churning waves, diluted into nothing before the ship has moved a single length forward. These acts may seem crude, but each one is an exhalation, a release, a way of making sure the ship never traps what the sea can easily consume. And when the men row, bodies rocking forward and back, muscles pulling in unison, oars slapping into the water with the steady reassurance of a heartbeat, they are not simply propelling themselves through the world, but stirring the very air around them, keeping it alive, keeping it moving, preventing it from stagnating the way it would beneath the low ceilings of later, grander ships. The Longship has no hold where foulness can hide, no dark corner where moisture can rot wood, no sealed room where breath can linger and thicken into sickness. Everything is exposed to wind and salt before it becomes dangerous. Then consider the very texture of the voyage. The endless cold that stiffens fingers and bleaches the smell from wool, the salt that cakes on cloaks and takes with it the sweat that might otherwise feed bacteria, the spray that slaps every surface and leaves nothing untouched long enough to harbour decay. The Vikings cursed this cold, wrapped themselves in layers to survive it. And yet it was this same cold that protected them, turning their ship into a poor home for the quiet killers that thrived in warmer climates. On land, disease had soil and shelter. At sea, on a Viking ship, it had nothing but wind. And when the coastline appears, even faintly, even as a smudge of darker shadow against grey sky, the men begin their preparations with the same slow, practiced assurance they bring to every part of their lives. They know that land means release from the cramped and shifting world of the deck, that it means privacy, washing, fires, cleansing, the chance to absorb the messiness of human life into earth and wind rather than confining it to wood and ropes. They disembark, spreading across the shore like a tide of wool and leather, each step erasing a little of the biological burden they carried aboard. They relieve themselves far from the waterline. They wash their hands in streams so cold they sting. They air out their cloaks and rest their sore muscles, allowing the ship to become a clean, empty shell waiting for their return. And when they return, fed, cleaned, refreshed, the Longship takes them in again with the same open indifference, its planks rinsed by wind, its seams flushed by seawater, its bilge already thinned and lightened by the tide, its world reset. There is no memory of the previous discomforts, because the ship itself refuses to remember. It cannot store filth. It cannot trap heat. It cannot structure itself into the dark corners where sickness breeds. It simply moves forward, carrying men who have learned to move with it. This is why the Vikings did not become sick in the catastrophic waves that later swept through crews on ships with enclosed decks and shared water barrels and sealed, humid holds. The Vikings lived in a state of constant exposure, constant renewal, constant cleansing, a life that looked harsh to outsiders but which acted, accidentally, instinctively, powerfully, as one of the most effective anti-disease systems in early maritime history. And so, when you imagine them now, tired, wind-burned, leaning into the oars as stars turn slowly overhead, you begin to see that their survival was not the product of strength alone, nor luck, nor divine favour, but a design of life in which nothing remained still, nothing was allowed to linger. and nothing poisonous was given the time or the shelter to grow into danger, making the longship not just a vehicle of war and exploration but a floating mechanism of cleanliness, crafted entirely by the logic of the natural. And as the night wears on, and the longship glides across the dark water like a shadow drawn in ink, you start to see that the Vikings' entire relationship with their vessel was shaped by a single, unspoken truth: that the ship could only remain safe so long as it never pretended to be anything other than open, temporary, exposed, and endlessly cleansed by the world around it. Because the instant a longship tried to imitate a house, with walls, with rooms, with enclosed corners and sealed spaces, it would cease to be a sanctuary, and would instead become a trap where every breath, every drop of moisture, every fragment of waste would gather, ferment, rot, and rise again as sickness. What kept them healthy was not comfort but discomfort. The sharp wind that never stopped cutting across the deck, the cold spray that soaked their cloaks and scoured their hands, the absence of roofs and walls that left them feeling vulnerable, but kept the air too fresh and too restless for disease to settle. They lived on a platform exposed to the sky, a wooden spine held aloft by nothing but the ocean itself, and in that exposure they found a safety more profound than the illusion of shelter. Picture it now. The ship rolls gently beneath the stars. A thin mist of seawater hangs in the air. The men breathe in and their breath disappears instantly, torn away by the wind before it can even cool on their lips. No humid cloud of shared exhalation accumulates above them. No stagnant warmth clings to their bodies. The air is too clean, too cold, too wild to allow anything to linger. Each inhale is ocean wind, each exhale gone before it can return. Then look at the planks beneath your imagined feet, glistening with a sheen of brine. The bilge below is never still. Water seeps in, is scooped out, seeps in again, is thrown over the side. It is a perpetual cycle that denies bacteria the one thing they need most: time. On later ships, the bilge would sit warm and dark, a foul soup where contamination brewed quietly for weeks. On a Viking longship, the bilge is a restless thing, always in contact with fresh seawater, always diluted, always removed before it can change form. Even the men's own habits mirror this refusal to let anything accumulate. Their grooming rituals, brushing out lice, washing with cold sand, combing hair daily, are not luxuries but a continuation of the same rhythm. Never let filth sit, never allow parasites to establish themselves, never give dirt or disease a fixed home. Their weekly bathing, their rotating chores, their communal pressure to appear tidy even on the roughest voyages, all reinforce the idea that the ship's vulnerabilities can only be contained by constant, unrelenting motion and attention. And when the coastline appears, whether a sandy cove, a pebble beach, a grassy inlet, or a rocky fjord, the crew does not hesitate. They guide the ship toward land with a kind of reverence, as if the very act of touching shore is a gift. They step off, scatter across the dunes or the forest floor, and in those few hours everything resets. Waste disappears into soil instead of festering in a corner. Bodies are washed in streams or with handfuls of cold water. Clothing is aired out. Cooking fires burn away dampness and smell, and the biological weight of shipboard life dissolves into the landscape like breath on a winter morning. By the time they reboard, the ship is once again a clean, empty canvas. Clean not because it was scrubbed, but because nothing was ever allowed to stay dirty for long. The sea has rinsed it, the wind has dried it, the cold has purified it, and the rituals of the crew have reset every personal vector of disease before it could gather strength. This constant cycle, open deck, cold wind, leaky hull, frequent landings, cultural hygiene, fermented provisions, is not a sanitation plan in the modern sense. It is a way of existing, an instinctive partnership with the environment. It turns the harshness of the Viking world into a type of medicine, the cold into a disinfectant, the spray into a cleansing force, the wind into a purifier, and the ship itself into a place where danger is always present but never permitted to settle. And so these men, living on a vessel that logic suggests should have been overcome by stench and sickness, instead crossed the North Atlantic repeatedly, reaching Iceland, Greenland and North America, not because they conquered the sea, but because they allowed the sea to reshape their lives into a pattern where disease could not keep pace with their movement. In the end, their survival came from a truth older than science, and as wide as the ocean itself, a world that never rests cannot easily rot, and a ship that refuses to trap anything, air, water, heat, or waste, becomes not a breeding ground for sickness, but a place where illness simply cannot find a home. And as the stars wheel slowly overhead, mirrored in faint trembling shards on the black water below, you begin to understand that the Vikings' entire sanitation strategy, so crude in appearance, so simple in action, so utterly effective in practice, was rooted in the oldest maritime truth of all, that the sea itself will keep you alive if you never try to seal yourself away from it, and it will kill you the moment you attempt to tame it with walls and compartments that trap the heat and breath and waste that your own body produces. For on a Viking longship, nothing ever remained long enough to decay. Waste from the body went straight into the sea, where it vanished instantly into the vast, indifferent churn of salt water. Waste from the bilge never sat long enough to sour, because the hull leaked just enough to force the crew into constant bailing, turning the bottom of the ship into a place too dynamic for rot to begin. Waste from breath and sweat was carried away by wind that never stopped slicing across the open deck, leaving no pocket of air warm enough or still enough to incubate disease. Imagine looking up now. The sky is huge, endless, exposed. Without a roof above them, the Vikings slept beneath a dome of cold air that swept away humidity before it could turn stale, and they woke each morning with frost on their cloaks, their hair stiff with salt, their lungs filled with air that tasted clean because it had crossed an ocean to reach their lips. There was no enclosed sleeping deck where warmth and moisture spiraled into sickness, only the open world, always cleansing, always moving. Then imagine looking down. The planks beneath your feet aren't dry boards neatly sealed with resin, but living strips of oak that breathe with the sea, taking in water and letting it out again, creating a bilge that is never truly still and never truly warm. The men haul up balers carved from wood, scooping and heaving, their movements in tune with the roll of the ship. In another kind of vessel, these pockets of standing water would be a silent threat. Here they are just another heartbeat in the ship's rhythm, never allowed to stagnate. Even the men's supplies match this restless pattern. The beer they drink has been boiled, unknowingly killing the microbes that cause illness. The sour milk they carry is preserved by its own acidity. The dried fish and smoked meats, they do not spoil easily, nor do they require the warm, enclosed storage that would turn a ship into a pantry for pathogens. Everything they consume is resistant to rot, because it has already undergone a transformation through fire, through smoke, through fermentation, that removes or suppresses the very organisms that later crews would battle for centuries. Now picture their landfalls, the gentle scraping of the keel against sand or gravel, the sigh of relief that spreads through the crew as they step off into a world of space and air. They spread out, each man drifting toward the tree line or the dunes, creating distance between bodies so that whatever discomfort or filth they carry is absorbed into the vastness around them. Fires crackle, clothing dries, waste disappears into soil instead of lingering in the wooden membrane of the ship. And by the time they push off again, the biological burden of the voyage has been carried away by wind and earth, leaving the longship a clean platform once more. Nothing remains long enough to poison them. Not the water in the bilge, not the waste of the body, not the breath of the lungs, not the warmth of close quarters, not the scraps of food, not the moisture on their clothes. Everything is immediately turned into something else. Salt in the sea, steam in the air, ash in the fire, soil on the land. And this is why, as the longship cuts through the dark water like a knife, its wake folding behind it before vanishing into the indifferent vastness, the Vikings remained astonishingly healthy, in conditions that should have been lethal. They lived in a world where nothing stayed, Nothing settled. Nothing was allowed to grow roots or build colonies or take hold. Their ship was not a home. It was not a chamber. It was not a place of stillness. It was a moving edge between wind and water, a threshold rather than a container. And so long as they remained on that threshold, exposed, cold, uncomfortable but never trapped, they stayed alive in ways that would puzzle later generations who built bigger ships, stronger walls and deeper holds, only to learn that sickness thrives wherever humans try too hard to shut the world out. In the end, the Vikings survived because their longships never pretended to be anything other than open to the world, and the world, harsh, wild, relentless, kept them clean in the only way nature knows, by refusing to give disease a place to rest. And as the longship pushes onward into the final hours before dawn, with the northern wind weaving its cold fingers through every fold of wool and leather, you begin to understand that this entire Viking approach to health at sea was not just accidental efficiency, but a kind of deep instinctive alignment with the physics of the world, a trust in the idea that nothing dangerous can thrive where everything is in motion, everything is exposed, everything is stripped bare by salt and air and cold before it can ever become a threat. For a Viking longship is almost absurdly open compared to the vessels that came centuries later, where later ships would seal their crews inside wooden chambers that trapped heat and breath and moisture. The longship gave its men no refuge from the elements, and that deprivation turned into their greatest shield. The air above the ship is always sweeping clean, never collecting the stale humidity that spreads illness. The deck is always rinsed by spray, never allowing sweat or spilled food to dry into sticky films where bacteria could grow. The hull is always leaking just enough to demand bailing, never letting water pool long enough to become foul. Consider how each man sleeps wrapped in his cloak, beneath a sky so sharp with stars that it seems to cut the darkness into gleaming shards, his breath forming brief clouds that evaporate into nothing before they can settle on the boards. There is no shared warm bunk room, no humid sleeping quarters filled with recirculated air, only the open world, washing away every exhalation with indifference. Even discomfort becomes a kind of armor. Then imagine how they begin the morning, stiff, cold limbs aching from rowing, yet already brushing their hair with bone combs worn smooth by use, rinsing bowls in seawater, shaking out cloaks stiff with frost. These habits seem small, but each one interrupts the cycle of filth before it becomes a cycle of disease. A louse combed out today does not produce a brood tomorrow. A cloak aired out in cold wind does not trap yesterday's sweat. A bowl rinsed in salt water does not host bacteria overnight. And think of their food, how it too reflects the same principle. Weak beer boiled into safety, sour milk preserved by acidity, dried fish and smoked meat stripped of moisture before they ever set foot on the ship. Their provisions do not rot easily, and because they do not rot, they do not become vectors for illness, sparing the crew from the foodborne sickness that ravaged later, more advanced navies. Even the sea, relentless in its intrusions, becomes their partner. It washes the deck. It dilutes waste. It scours the hull. Every splash is a tiny purification. Every wave a reminder that nothing can remain dirty for long when the ocean itself demands motion. And when land appears, when the ship noses into a quiet inlet or scrapes across a gravel shore, the men step off as if crossing into another world. They relieve themselves far from camp, spreading out so wide that no single patch of ground becomes fouled. They wash in icy streams. They dry their clothing by firelight. The ship, empty, still rocking slightly in the shallows, breathes out the last remnants of the voyage, while the crew resets themselves on land, returning cleansed, reset, renewed. So the longship becomes a place without memory. It does not retain yesterday's waste or sweat or breath. It does not hold on to moisture. It does not offer pockets of warmth for disease to breed. Everything that happens aboard is swept away by wind or water or ritual before it has the chance to become something more dangerous. And this is why the Vikings, travelling in vessels that appear primitive by later standards, was spared the mass outbreaks that crippled so many later crews. It is why they survived weeks at sea without turning their ships into floating sickness factories. It is why their voyages stretched across oceans that would have destroyed men who relied on enclosed cabins and stored water and sealed holds. They survived because the Longship was the opposite of a closed environment. They survived because nothing stayed still. They survived because the world around them, cold, harsh, immense, never allowed the ship to become anything other than clean by exposure. And as the first pale thread of daylight begins to slip across the horizon, illuminating the spray frozen on the shields and the frost caught in the men's beards, you finally see what kept them alive, a life lived entirely in motion, a ship that refused to trap what the sea could wash away, and a culture that treated cleanliness as habit, pride and necessity, long before anyone understood the science behind the instinct. And as the first faint shimmer of dawn brushes the horizon, turning the black surface of the sea into a dark slate streaked with trembling silver, you begin to see that the Vikings did not merely endure the harshness of their environment. They synchronized themselves with it, letting the cold and the wind and the ceaseless motion of the Longship shape their habits, their routines, even their sense of what it meant to stay alive in a place where the slightest misjudgment could become fatal. This was not sanitation in the way we define it today, with rules and structures and enclosed systems, but a living, breathing equilibrium in which the sea itself was the chief cleanser, the wind the chief purifier, and movement the most potent medicine. Because nothing aboard a longship was ever allowed to settle into the kind of stagnant stillness that disease requires. Every surface was drenched by spray, every breath swept away by wind, every drop of bilge water scooped out before the sun could warm it. Even the men's bodies were part of this dance, their sweat never left to dry into sour residue, their cloaks never left hanging long enough to trap moisture, their hair never permitted to become a nest for parasites. They groomed themselves not out of vanity, but because on a ship where 65 lives depended on one another, the shame of neglect could ripple through the crew faster than illness itself. And this constant vigilance extended to every aspect of their travel. When the Longship entered a calm stretch of water, and the oars dipped in slow, deliberate strokes, the men moved with a practiced rhythm that kept the deck alive. The shifting of feet, the passing of provisions, the tightening of straps and knots, all small acts that denied filth the chance to accumulate. When the wind picked up and the sail unfurled with a long cracking sigh, the increased speed brought more spray, more cleansing, more disturbance of the surfaces where bacteria might have otherwise found a foothold. Even the cold morning served a purpose. Frost stiffened fabric, slowed microbial growth, and acted as a natural barrier against the invisible threats that flourished on warmer seas. A Viking waking up with a cloak rimmed in ice was not merely experiencing discomfort, he was sleeping in an environment hostile to disease. Each breath of frigid air, another blow against the microbes that found warmth and stillness so appealing. And when a storm approached, the readiness of the crew was not merely a matter of seamanship, but of sanitation as well. They secured their gear, tightened their cloaks, and prepared buckets, not just to bail the incoming waves, but to ensure that any temporary waste generated under the duress of violent seas never lingered aboard longer than absolutely necessary. They waited out the chaos, shivering and soaked, knowing that the very same storm that threatened their lives also protected them, for nothing festers in a world where everything is being churned and thrown and scoured by salt water and wind. Then, as the storm passed and the ship steadied, the men resumed their quiet rituals, emptying buckets into the sea with swift, almost reverent motions, rinsing their hands with freezing seawater, brushing their hair even though knots had formed in the night, straightening their cloaks, tightening belts, restoring the delicate order of the deck. Everything they did, every gesture, every habit was a way of refusing stillness, a way of denying the ship the chance to turn into a sealed, festering world like so many later vessels would become. And as the coastline comes into view again, a thin strip of shadow against the pale morning light, They prepare for the landing with the same anticipation as if reaching a sacred refuge. Land is safety not because of the food it offers or the rest it promises, but because it resets the ship entirely. Each man steps onto soil, walks a short distance away, and the accumulated burden of human life dissolves into a world large enough to absorb it. Clothing is dried. Bodies are washed, even if with just cold water and handfuls of sand. The ship, empty in the shallows, seems to breathe in the clean air, its planks steaming faintly in the rising sun. By the time they push off again, the deck is cleansed by absence, the crew revived by ritual, and the journey refreshed. This cycle repeats, again and again, until the voyage ends, not because of technology, not because of medicine, but because the Vikings lived in harmony with a truth. The sea had been teaching humans since the beginning of time. That sickness grows best in places where air is trapped. Water stands still, warmth accumulates, and the world is kept out. On a Viking longship, the world was never kept out. It was everywhere. On their skin, in their lungs, on the boards beneath them, in every cup they drank from, and every wave that slapped the hull. And that openness, harsh as it was, became their greatest protection. It kept them alive long enough to cross oceans others would never dare. And as the longship glides farther into that pale northern dawn, with the sun still hiding just below the edge of the world, and the light spreading in slow, trembling layers like breath on cold glass, you begin to sense that what kept the Vikings alive on these voyages was not simply a collection of practical habits or accidental advantages, but a whole philosophy of living, unspoken, unwritten, absorbed through generations, built around the idea that a human being survives not by sealing himself off from the world, but by allowing the world to move through him and around him, carrying away everything that, if trapped, would destroy him. For look now at the deck as the morning light grows stronger. Every board is wet, not with stagnant moisture, but with the clean residue of the night's waves. Every shield hung along the gunwale carries a thin sheen of frost that will melt into salt water as soon as the first rays touch it. Every man's cloak is stiff with cold, the fabric almost humming with the energy of the wind that has combed through it all night. This is not comfort. This is cleansing. The longship is a place where nature does the work of hygiene more reliably than any crafted system could. The men rise slowly, stretching sore arms, rubbing their faces, shaking the stiffness from their clothes. The first thing several of them do before eating, before speaking, is reach for their combs, pulling the bone teeth carefully through tangled hair, shaking off anything that might have found shelter during the night. These rituals are tiny but relentless, and in their repetition they become as essential to survival as the oars themselves. No one aboard expects to be comfortable, but everyone aboard expects to be clean enough, because the line between clean enough and sick is thinner on a longship than anywhere else. Then comes the handling of provisions. A skin of weak beer is passed around, flat, sour, barely alcoholic, yet more precious than gold because it has been boiled into safety. A man gnaws on dried fish, its taste sharp with salt, its texture hard but free of the decay that warm, enclosed storage would have invited. Another chews on a strip of smoked lamb, preserved not only by smoke but by the cold that wraps around them like a second skin. You can almost see how the environment collaborates with their food, turning spoilage into an impossibility. And when they prepare to row again, gripping the oars with hands still red from the cold, the rhythm of the vessel takes over, a rhythm that prevents any corner from slipping into silence. The oars rise and fall, forcing movement into the very air. The hull creaks, reminding them that wood and water are in constant negotiation. The waves splash across the deck in small repeated baptisms, and the men through their labour keep the ship alive, awake, clean by virtue of its restlessness. If this ship had walls, the cold breath of the sea would not reach them. If it had decks below, the air would grow heavy. If it had enclosed sleeping quarters, the warmth of the men's bodies would rot into the wood. If it had storage rooms, the food would sour, and the barrels would poison them. But it has none of these things. It has only openness. and openness is what saves them. Now imagine the wind shifting, blowing in from the west with the smell of distant land, peat perhaps, or pine, or wet soil, and the men look up, eyes narrowing against the brightness beginning to grow behind the clouds. Without a word, the steersman leans his weight on the great steering oar, and the ship begins to angle toward the smell, toward the faint promise of ground. The men lean into the oars, the pace quickening, and soon a coastline emerges like a shadow turned solid. When the ship grinds softly onto a strip of sand, the transformation is immediate. Men step off in a loose scatter, stretching their legs, loosening their cloaks. One heads toward a rise to relieve himself. Another wades into shallows to rinse his hands and face. Several others begin collecting driftwood for a fire. Their actions, though mundane, are part of a larger pattern, a ritual of dispersal and renewal that resets the entire biological environment of the voyage. No waste remains on the ship. No accumulated stench is trapped beneath planks. No pocket of stale air survives long enough to poison them. No residue of yesterday's life lingers into the next day's journey. And when they eventually launch again, pushing the Longship back into the cold embrace of the sea, the deck feels strangely new, as if the ship itself has been reborn, scrubbed clean not by intentional design, but by the vast, indifferent machinery of wind, water, earth, and habit working together. This, in the end, is the quiet genius of Viking survival. They never allowed filth to become history. They never let waste become memory. They never let their bodies or their ship become repositories of yesterday. Everything was carried away, dissolved, scattered, absorbed by sea, by wind, by land, because sickness requires stillness. And nothing aboard a Viking longship was ever still. And as the sun finally lifts itself above the horizon, slowly, reluctantly, like a tired old god rising from a cold bed of clouds, you begin to understand the deepest truth hidden in the quiet mechanics of Viking life at sea, that the longship was not merely a vehicle of exploration or war, but a carefully balanced ecosystem in which survival depended on the absolute refusal to let anything, air, water, waste, warmth, or even comfort, remain in one place long enough to turn against the men who depended on it. Every moment aboard was an act of motion, every breath an exchange with the untamed world, every discomfort a shield against the unseen dangers that later, more sheltered sailors would be forced to name. For now, in this pale and growing light, imagine the entire crew reaching a soft, coordinated awakening. There is no trumpet, no bell, no officer barking orders, only the natural stirring of bodies in the cold. A man shifts, pulling his cloak tighter. Another lifts his head to peer across the waves. Another stands, stretching stiff shoulders while his breath forms a brief cloud that vanishes before it can drift back into anyone's lungs. The air is so clean, so sharp, so constantly refreshed, that even with 65 men sharing the space, no breath becomes another man's burden. The deck itself glistens with a thin layer of frost that melts into salted droplets as the first rays touch it, and the men instinctively begin wiping, brushing, shaking their gear, not to polish it, but to keep the deck from turning slick. This simple motion again denies stillness, again prevents accumulation, again ensures the ship never traps what the environment is prepared to erase. One man walks to the rail, and as he leans out to relieve himself, the wind takes everything away before he has even taken a second breath. There is no bucket sitting full, no corner set aside, nothing that lingers, nothing that waits. Everything becomes the sea's responsibility within seconds. What could have been contamination becomes a ripple of water, a momentary disturbance, a disappearing trace in an ocean that has swallowed the waste of empires. And still the ship moves. Oars dip, rise, the rhythm forming a steady pulse that keeps the deck alive. The longship is like a lung expanding and contracting, exhaling waste, inhaling bitter clean air. Every stroke of the oar pushes wind along the planks, pushing pathogens away before they can settle. Even the rope fibers remain too wet and too cold for germs to hide. Now imagine the men passing around a skin of weak beer, They drink not because it tastes pleasant, but because it sustains them safely. The beer has been boiled in its making, unknowingly sterilized by necessity. The sour milk kept in leather pouches has a pH so low that bacteria cannot bloom inside it. There are no barrels of warm, stagnant water that other navies would later fear. There is nothing on this ship that sits long enough to turn into poison. Food is passed hand to hand, dried fish torn apart with fingers, hard bread softened by soaking it briefly in seawater, smoked meat gnawed with a kind of grateful determination. These foods do not rot. They do not breed illness. The diet is monotonous, yes, but it is safe, and safety in these brutal waters is its own form of luxury. Then picture the coastline drawing nearer again. This time a rugged fjord, steep cliffs rising like the ribs of the world. The steersman calls out a few quiet instructions, and the crew adjusts, guiding the ship with a precision that would impress any navigator centuries later. The hull slides toward a small patch of gravel, and once again the men spill off the ship like a tide, each moving with the instinctive understanding that land is a cleansing station, a reset point, a place where the burdens of the voyage can dissolve into soil and fresh air. Some relieve themselves far inland, some rinse their arms in freezing streams, some shake out their bedding in the wind, others gather driftwood and coax a fire to life, letting its smoke permeate their cloaks, another layer of accidental hygiene, as smoke repels insects, suppresses odor, and preserves fabric. What they do not do is linger in filth. What they do not do is allow yesterday's waste to become tomorrow's disease. What they do not do is build structures that would trap their own biology. And when they push off again, launching the longship into deeper water, the deck feels new, purified by absence. The men once again part of a system they never consciously designed, but long ago learned to trust. A system where nature is not the enemy but a collaborator, where motion is medicine, and where the refusal to build a bathroom becomes, paradoxically, the most effective sanitation technology of their age. This is why they survived oceans that should have killed them. This is why their longships remained operational for centuries. This is why crews did not collapse into epidemics that wiped out entire expeditions. Because the Vikings lived in a world where nature cleaned what humans could not. Because they understood, even without understanding, that the moment you trap your own waste, your own warmth, your own breath, you trap your own death. And the longship, open, raw, exposed, restless, never trapped anything. And as the morning strengthens, spilling pale gold across the rippling water, and illuminating the longship in a thin wash of light, you begin to perceive the final, most profound layer of this Viking reality, that the longship was not merely engineered wood and iron, but a philosophy in motion, a floating reminder that life on the edge of the world demanded a kind of disciplined humility, a willingness to accept that survival depended less on controlling nature, and more on yielding to it in ways that prevented the dangers of stillness, rot, and confinement from ever taking root. Now imagine the full crew awake, each man rising slowly from his cloak, stamping cold from his feet, rubbing warmth back into stiff fingers. They do not wake into silence. They wake into wind, into spray, into a kind of restless cleanliness that surrounds them like a living force. The longship creaks beneath them, its hull flexing with every wave. There are no compartments trapping stale air, no enclosed cabins holding the ghosts of last night's breath. Every exhale dissolves into the sky. Every motion stirs the air. Every shiver of cold is a reminder that the world is larger and harsher than they are, but also cleaner. One man walks toward the prow, splashing his face with seawater. Another rinses his hands in the same icy brine. A third lifts a wooden ladle from a skin of weak beer, passing it without ceremony to the next man. This simple sharing, practical, necessary, familiar, is also protected by nature's chemistry, the beer, boiled into existence, the sour milk, preserved by acidity, the dried fish, immune to decay. Their diet is plain, sometimes miserable, but it is untainted by the hidden pathogens that would haunt later mariners who stored water in sealed barrels and provisions in warm holds. The Vikings, without realizing it, built their entire system around the idea that if food and drink do not rot, neither do the men who consume them. Now turn your eyes to the hull, the elegant curve of overlapping planks lapped and sealed with tar and animal hair. Water seeps through these seams the way breath seeps through lips, and the men answer this intrusion by bailing again and again, hour after hour. It seems like a chore. It is a chore, and yet it is also protection. No bilge on a Viking ship ever becomes a stagnant pit of filth. No hidden puddle ever waits long enough to become thick with decay. Every drop that enters is swiftly mixed, diluted, and thrown back into the sea, clearing the belly of the ship before anything dangerous has time to grow. If the ship had been perfectly sealed, if it had been stronger, thicker, more advanced, it would have killed them. Instead, it saved them, because it never allowed water or waste to stay. And now the horizon reveals another shore, a narrow inlet shaped like a crescent, guarded by low cliffs and wind-bent grass. The steersman guides the longship as if it were an extension of his own spine, and the vessel glides onto the sand with a soft, gritty sigh. The men disembark, some stretching their legs, some heading inland, some kneeling to wash their hands in a cold stream that trickles between stones. The land absorbs what the ship cannot hold. The wind takes the rest. No mess lingers, no contamination remains, no disease accumulates. And the ship, left briefly empty, rocks gently in the shallows, its planks steaming faintly in the morning sun. It looks almost alive, breathing, cleansing, resetting, waiting for the crew to return cleansed by land, as the sea had cleansed the ship. As the day moves on, the men repair gear, rinse clothing, shake out bedding, scrape mud from boots, rewrap cloaks that have stiffened in the wind. A fire crackles and smoke drifts through the camp, settling into wool and leather, adding another accidental layer of preservation. Smoke repels insects. Smoke dries moisture. Smoke purifies, and without trying, the Vikings amplify the natural cleansing cycle that keeps them alive. By afternoon, the longship is ready. The men push it back into deeper water, each footstep leaving behind one more trace of human biology absorbed into the earth instead of the deck. The ship takes them in again, rocking with familiar strength. They climb aboard, lean into the oars, and the wind fills the sail. Again the sea becomes their purifier. Again the rhythm of movement resumes. Again the world prevents any threat from staying long enough to become deadly. And now, as the ship pushes westward, the truth becomes unmistakable. The Vikings survived because they never let the longship become a sealed world. They never allowed air to stagnate, waste to accumulate, food to decay, or breath to linger. They lived in an environment that punished stillness and rewarded constant motion, and by accepting that reality, by surrendering to the cold, the wind, the seawater, the exposure, they crafted, without ever intending to, one of the most effective health protection systems in the ancient world. They survived because the longship was never a room, never a chamber, never a shelter in the way we understand shelter. It was an edge between worlds, part sea, part air, part land. And so, as the longship pushes onward into the widening morning, its prow slicing through the pale green water with the quiet confidence of something that has crossed these seas 1,000 times before, you realize that the true genius of Viking sanitation, the real secret hidden beneath all the spray and the wind and the cold, was not a trick or an invention or a device, but a mindset, an understanding, older than writing and deeper than conscious thought, that survival on the open ocean depends not on trying to seal yourself away from nature, but on letting nature sweep through your life so completely that nothing dangerous ever has the stillness or the shelter it needs to become deadly. And in this way the Vikings, without knowing the words for bacteria or infection or contamination, built a world in which disease simply could not gather its strength. As the men row and breathe and eat and clean and laugh and endure, they are participating in a continuous ritual of renewal, a rhythm in which every discomfort becomes a form of protection, every wave a cleansing force, every landing a chance to reset the fragile biology of the voyage. And as you watch the ship disappear slowly into the horizon, leaving behind nothing but a faint white wake dissolving into the heart of the sea, you understand at last that these sailors survived because they refused to trap anything. Not their breath, not their warmth, not their waste, not even their sense of self within the narrow confines of the ship, choosing instead to let the world carry everything away before it could turn against them. And in that surrender to motion and exposure and change, they found a way to live and travel and endure where so many others later failed, proving that sometimes the oldest solution of all is simply this: let nothing stay long enough to harm you, and the sea will take care of the rest.